Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited to start our trade guide series here on the channel leading up to the 2025 NBA trade deadline. And in today's video, we're going to start with the Washington Wizards, a team that I think is extremely fascinating to monitor over the next few years. So if you're a DC native or a big time Washington Wizards fan, make sure to leave a like on today's video and subscribe so you don't miss out on future Washington Wizards content, because I think this team has a lot of intrigue moving forward, especially on the defensive end of the floor with some of their young pieces. They have some trade assets, they have some big contracts to move, they have some middling contracts to move, they have some trade exceptions. We're going to talk about all of that and more in today's video. As we look at this video preview, we're going to talk about tradable players and their contract situations. We're also going to look at the draft pick situation holistically in Washington. What assets do they actually have to move? We're then going to focus on the long-term cap space that this team has to work with. Is that an actual feasible outcome for Washington in the upcoming offseason? We're then also going to discuss potential trade partners. Which teams could I see Washington working with via trade, and who are some of the names that would be involved in some of those deals? Obviously, a lot of work has gone into this video to prepare this, and then also the projected activity level. So not only which teams could Washington be working with, which players could they theoretically trade or get in a trade, but also how active do I actually expect them to be come this February with the NBA trade deadline. First of all, I want to look at their draft pick situation, and it's a real huge thanks to Matt Ishbia, owner of the Phoenix Suns, for the current situation that is the Washington Wizards. The Wizards were able to get a collection of swap options with Phoenix from the Bradley Beal trade, one of the most inexplicable trades in recent NBA history. The deal really just never made sense. Beal had a no trade clause. The Suns didn't even make him get rid of the no trade clause in the deal. And while they could have given up significantly less to acquire his enormous contract, they did not. Now, ultimately, the Suns are kind of stuck with a big Bradley Beal problem, and the Wizards were able to get off that Bradley Beal problem a couple of years ago, which is incredible given the size and magnitude of his contract, the duration and term of that contract. So thank you to Matt Ishbia. If you're a Washington Wizards fan, you also own a 2029 first round pick, which has a little bit of swap optionality in it from the Denny Avdia trade this past offseason with the Portland Trailblazers. And then other than that, the Wizards do have control of their own first moving forward. Now, there is a little bit of nuance with that. There are protections on those picks. Now, the reason why I say that they have team control, the Washington Wizards are bad, and they're bad intentionally. Part of the reason that they're bad is to accumulate assets, add in extra talent through the NBA draft with obvious hopes for either Cooper Flagg or Dylan Harper or Ace Bailey in the 2025 NBA draft, and then moving forward, maybe someone like AJ DeBonsa in the 2026 NBA draft. Obviously, that would be on Washington's radar as well. But I think the biggest thing here is the Wizards are not only intentionally bad to get top-end talent, they're also intentionally bad to keep these draft picks. With the protections on them, it's very likely Washington will be able to actually just retain and keep these draft assets, so keep that in mind as well. Moving on here to some of their tradable players, I think this is where it really starts to get good if you want to talk about what the trade deadline could look like for Washington. The player I specifically wanted to start with was Kyle Kuzma, who is on a descending contract, has 2 years left on his contract after this current season. So he's under contract through 2027. He's got some real team control here on a descending contract, and that is extremely important. The Wizards have been doing that as of late with their players that they've been retaining, signing guys to descending contracts. Denny Avdia, for example, was on a descending contract. Kyle Kuzma is on a descending contract. And I think the importance with that, as we move a little bit further forward year after year, if the Wizards don't trade Kyle Kuzma, just like they did not last trade deadline, his contract becomes a little bit more tradable, a little bit more manageable for other teams. So that's one of the real benefits here of a descending contract compared to an ascending contract. Kuzma's value perceivably moves up a little bit as we go throughout the timeline here, going into future seasons if the Wizards don't trade him this year. To me, I'm not a huge Kyle Kuzma fan. I think Trading for him is a pretty significant risk, especially if you have to give up an actual serious, solid asset to get him. We'll talk about some potential destinations for Kyle Kuzma in just a little bit. Malcolm Brogdon, he's on an expiring deal, was of course part of that Denny Avdia trade. 1 year, $22.5 million contract is what he's currently on. He's been playing some pretty good basketball, has had some really nice moments this year for Washington. Did not obviously play at the beginning of the year, but since coming back has had some really strong moments, and I think his trade value specifically should stand out to teams that are contending, looking for a backup guard. Remember, he won Sixth Man of the Year with Boston a few years ago before being traded from Boston to Portland. The Celtics obviously vindicated in that decision, winning an NBA championship this past year. But Brogdon's still a good player, a player who I think can help championship teams. The one thing I'll say is, having looked around the marketplace quite a bit, spending a lot of time preparing for these videos, there's not a lot of teams that are going to be looking to take in $22.5 million contracts. I think that's going to be one of the issues here with both the Kuzma and Brogdon situation for Washington. I'm just not sure if there's going to be a significant marketplace for either of these two players, even though Kuzma is a quality starting forward, I think a lot of people would view him as, and Brogdon is obviously a high-quality backup guard. That price tag is going to be difficult for teams to get to, especially with the new hard cap mechanisms, with the new aprons, and then also the issue for second apron teams taking in bigger salaries. It's just not very feasible. It's not very, functional in the new salary cap situation that we have with the new CBA. So keep that in mind as well. Even though Brogdon should be a trade candidate, the Wizards last year did not trade Tyus Jones, and it's possible that maybe they just don't find a deal here for Malcolm Brogdon either this trade deadline. Richaun Holmes, he has a 2-year contract, 1 year after this season. That year next year is non-guaranteed. The Wizards signed him to that contract intentionally to basically work as trade fodder. If they want to work out a deal, they have Richaun Holmes' contract to include in a trade if they so desire to do so. Jonas Valanciunas, 3 years, $30 million. They got him in a sign and trade with the New Orleans Pelicans this past offseason. He makes $9.9 million this season. That's a very tradable number. There's a bunch of teams around the league that could really look for a big man. I think one that stands out to me is potentially the Phoenix Suns. We'll talk about them a little bit more later in this video probably. But the final year of Valanciunas' contract is also non-guaranteed. So there's some real flexibility here for teams if they're trying to trade for Jonas Valanciunas. If they want to view Richaun Holmes' contract as an expiring at this deadline, that's possible as well. There are some small guarantees in some of those deals, but for the most part, they're partially guaranteed at best. So that's an important note here. Teams could view Richaun Holmes as a way to get out of a contract, which Washington would definitely be willing to eat contracts. And then Valanciunas could be kind of a combination of that. A cheap contract, a player that teams could view as a real solid depth addition into their front court, while also viewing Valanciunas as a potential way to get out of a contract as well in a trade with Washington. The Wizards also have a couple of younger players here that I did include as tradable pieces in Saddiq Bey and Marvin Bagley. You'll notice that I did not include Jordan Poole on this list. I did not include any of the rookies like Keyshawn George, Bob Carrington, who's been having, I think, a pretty impressive rookie season considering where his draft slot was, and then also Alex Sarr. Even though he's struggling from the field throughout the year so far, I do think there's been a lot of upside we've seen from Sarr's play thus far. So I didn't include the rookies. I didn't include Jordan Poole and his Albatross contract just because I don't think it's very tradable at this point in time. But I do think Saddiq Bey maybe could be rerouted somewhere. Marvin Bagley, just like we talked about with Richaun Holmes, as a larger expiring contract, could make some sense to be used in a deal, whether that be as a second team or a third team, which leads me here to the future cap space. And I think this is a very important nugget here for the Washington Wizards, a team that, like I said earlier, is not really looking to step on the accelerator quite yet when it comes to winning. That's okay for them. They're not projected to have functional cap space as of right now in the 2025 offseason. Of course, with the trade deadline yet to come, that could change, right? If the Wizards were to trade some of their salaries, if they trade Valanciunas, if they trade Kyle Kuzma, if they move a bunch of different pieces for players that are under contract going into next season, they could find ways to open up money. I just don't think that's the route that Washington is going to aggressively look to go. In fact, I see kind of the opposite. I think Washington would be more willing to trade their expiring contracts to eat contracts from other teams if it means getting incentivized by taking a couple of second-round picks, maybe even a first-round pick for a real Albatross contract. I'm just not sure if that's really going to happen, though. I would bet against that, honestly. But cap space is not in the MO right now for Washington, and that's okay. Their goal, and this is what I've been saying for a couple of years now, their goal is roughly 2027. That's the year that they want to start to step on the accelerator. So the 2027 offseason specifically is the one that I have had circled as the kind of pivot point for Washington, where they turn from this rebuilding, retooling team after what Tommy Shepard had left them, which was a complete nightmare, disaster mess. They will, I think, be on the upswing and be a team that is ready to strike around 2027. So keep that in mind here when you're talking about the Washington Wizards. They're not a team right now that's trying to win. They're not a team right now that wants to win 30, 40 games a year. They're trying to tank for the lottery. They want to give themselves the best odds at getting top-end talent. And they're also lining themselves up in a way where a few years from now, 2027 offseason specifically, could be the year that they have real cap space to work with and are able to add serious NBA talent around their, at that point in time, existing young core nucleus of talent that they've gotten through the NBA draft. Moving on here to some trade exceptions. Again, we have a video up on the channel about all 30 teams and their trade exceptions. I do want to point out Washington specifically in this video. They have a $3.5 million trade exception, which expires January 14th of 2025. Not sure if they'll end up using that one, especially with the deadline date for that one being prior to the NBA trade deadline. That one makes it a little bit more tricky to predict if they'll use it or not. This $12.4 million trade exception, though, that expires a little bit after the NBA trade deadline, is a serious prime candidate to be used. A lot of teams do have trade exceptions right now, but not a lot of them can use it because of the hard cap situation with the new CBA. So the Wizards, who can functionally use this $12.4 million trade exception, could be a premier destination for a team to dump a mid-sized salary. So we're going to talk about an example of that here in just a second. But remember, they could use both of these figures to either take in a player or a contract via trade without having to match money. So, if you're looking at guys who were former late first-round picks, that $3.5 million number could be kind of a young swing and get for Washington. Could they land a player who hasn't really panned out in another situation right now? Potentially. That $12.4 million, maybe they use that to take in a contract the team doesn't want anymore, and they could get a second-round pick or maybe a couple of second-round picks in that kind of move as well. Swinging forward here for some teams to trade with, we have a few to talk about, and it really centers around whoever's going to be willing to take Kyle Kuzma. I think that's really the theme of this video so far. Kyle Kuzma, I just think with where his contract's at, it's not going to be a premier market for him, but I do think there are some teams that would value his skill set. The Lakers, a reunion there could seriously make some sense given the contracts that they have on their books. I could see them trying to find a way to get to that money mark to acquire Kyle Kuzma at this point in time, especially since he does have descending contract team control moving forward. A team like LA could value that. The Miami Heat, obviously there's a lot of questions right now around Jimmy Butler. Bam Adebayo has just not been his normal self, especially on the offensive end of the floor this year when it comes to finishing at the rim specifically. And then the Memphis Grizzlies, a team that still is loaded with all of their draft assets. They have a couple of mid-sized contracts that they could trade, like a Brandon Clark. They have obviously in there as well Luke Kennard. So the Grizzlies, if they're looking for kind of a consolidation trade, if they're looking to maybe make a meaningful upgrade from their 7th and 8th guy in their rotation to maybe adding a more of a 6th man type player in a Kyle Kuzma, or kind of a hybrid starting forward if they wanted to use him in that regard, those three teams could make some sense. But as I have listed here in the bottom right graphic, anyone that wants Kyle Kuzma is a team that Washington should be willing to work with. Last year, Dallas was a team that had really pondered trading for Kyle Kuzma. Kuzma ultimately was the one who shut that trade down, funny enough, citing that the Mavericks weren't a championship contending team, and that's where he wanted to play. The Mavericks then made their way to the NBA Finals. So I don't think they would have done that with Kyle Kuzma. That's kind of my viewpoint on Kuzma overall. So I do think that Kuzma is a player that, he puts up numbers. He's been a semi-effective player throughout his career so far, but I'm just not sure if the calories really match the impact he has for a winning team in my estimation. Now, there are a couple of other notes here. I have the Brooklyn Nets as a team listed here, and I have Malcolm Brogdon written down. And you might be saying, why would the Brooklyn Nets want Malcolm Brogdon? And this is a little bit more of an intricate detail that I think is extremely important to consider. The Nets have Cam Johnson, who's making a little bit over $23 million this season. And the Malcolm Brogdon contract, remember, is $22.5 million. Why are those two things related? And no, I'm not saying the Washington Wizards would trade for Cam Johnson. What I'm saying is, whatever team, whatever contending team, whatever team thinks that they have a real shot to push for an NBA championship this year, whichever one of those teams wants Cam Johnson, they probably don't have the perfect salaries to send back to a team like Brooklyn, who I think is prioritizing cap space, prioritizing flexibility a little bit more so than Washington. I think a 3-team trade here makes a ton of sense. Cam Johnson goes to contending team X. Contending team X and their players could theoretically go to Washington. Washington maybe gets a second-round pick in the deal. And the Nets, remember, might be trading Dennis Schroeder. They might be trading Dorian Finney-Smith. They're kind of in a teardown right now, and taking back an expiring contract like Malcolm Brogdon would not be the worst thing for Brooklyn, giving them extra flexibility this offseason, whether they want to use that to maybe bring in other players via trade, using that cap space, or if they wanted to operate in a way where they're just trying to kind of prioritize or open up as much space as possible. Getting Malcolm Brogdon in instead of some other deals that maybe are spanning 2-3 years makes a lot of sense. Washington can get a little bit of draft compensation for helping Brooklyn out in this kind of setting. I think that kind of deal makes a ton of sense, and honestly, I would not be shocked if Washington gets involved as a third team like this during the NBA trade deadline this season. The Clippers as well, I have listed here as PJ Tucker, and Wizards fans are going to say, well, we don't want PJ Tucker. Yeah, that's exactly the point. PJ Tucker is making $11.5 million here. The Clippers do not want him. He has not played for them, obviously, been away from the team. The Clippers, what they really want to do is use that $11.5 million and open up a way to add a veteran player, add probably a point guard off the bench for them this season. And while the Wizards don't have an $11.5 million player that they could trade to the Clippers, what they do have is that $12.4 million trade exception we talked about earlier. PJ Tucker can fit into that trade exception. The Clippers can give up maybe a second-round pick or two to get a deal done where they bring in some other veteran caliber guard in return as part of a 3-team trade. Remember, 3-team trades are going to be really the lifeblood here for Washington. I think this trade deadline helping other teams get deals done, working in there to get as many small draft assets as possible, maintaining long-term future flexibility. The Wizards are going to be willing to eat contracts. They're going to be willing to take in players in return. And I think the Clippers are a team that we could see work with Washington, just like I said about Brooklyn. Dennis Schroeder makes some sense for Washington as a potential swap here, or for the Clippers as a potential swap as well. So maybe even a 3-team trade between Washington, Brooklyn, and LA could all make some sense here at this point in time. Moving on to projected activity level, like I've talked about multiple times, I think the Wizards will be seriously involved in this NBA trade deadline. Now, it doesn't mean I think they're going to make 4, 5, 6 trades, but what I think it means to me is Michael Winger and Will Dawkins are going to be answering the phone, and they're even going to be placing some calls as well. They're going to try and figure out deals that make sense for the future direction of the Washington Wizards. If they can find a Kyle Kuzma trade, I think they'll make one. If they can find a way to add in draft assets working as a third team in a trade, they will do so. I think the third team functionality with a $22.5 million Brogdon contract, a $12.5 million Bagley contract, Rashawn Holmes' contract makes sense. Sadiq Bey, even as a smaller option at about $6 million annually, could make some sense as a pivot point for teams to maybe get other players instead of the pieces from the team that they're trying to get the initial trade done with. Kyle Kuzma, like I said multiple times, I'm not sure if he gets traded. I just don't think the marketplace is going to be that interested in him. Unfortunately for Washington, but with the descending contract moving forward, they'll be able to trade him in a future year as his contract moves from 3 years to 2 years, and then maybe even hypothetically 2 years to 1 year left as an expiring deal. Kuzma, I think, will get traded at some point in time on his current contract. It just doesn't necessarily mean that it will be this trade deadline. Jonas Valanciunas, like I've talked about, is a sleeper option to get traded. The Lakers, I think, make some sense. They're looking for a real center to play next to Anthony Davis. They have been for some time. He could be a serious option there. Memphis could make some sense too in a little bit of a reunion. I know the Grizzlies do have a pretty solid collection of big men, but looking to add more bodies to deal with a Nikola Jokic in the playoffs, to deal with a Derek Lively, Daniel Gafford combination. Valanciunas, I'm not a huge fan of. I think he's probably like the 28th, 32nd best center in the league at this point in time. But he's still a quality big man who can catch the basketball, finish in traffic. You can post him up a little bit. He sets okay screens. He's a solid option. The player I do think is going to be a real litmus test for the direction of this Wizards team is going to be Corey Kispert. If they trade him this year, he's technically on a poison pill provision. So it would kind of manipulate their cap tables a little bit. It would kind of add a little bit of problematic money into there. just with the way that it works, it'd be very hard to trade him. But his extension wasn't huge, so it's not like the most difficult thing to do, especially given Washington's trade exception. Will they trade Corey Kispert like they traded Denny Avdia? I'm not exactly sure on that. I could see it as a realistic possibility, but the Wizards are not good. So if they want to keep Kispert, I think for the long-term future, having that wing shooter makes sense for them. But if they do decide to trade him, it's not like it's going to completely rock their world either. I hope you guys really did enjoy. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content. Wizards fans, really appreciate you guys so much. Thank you again so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.